As the Senate, I would move that we adopt the substitute which conformed Delegate Reed's bill 714 to Senator Favola's bill, which passed out of here earlier this year, and set up a series of goals for our state with respect to carbon-free and free of fossil fuel use. And I would yield to Senator Favola if she wants to explain it. Otherwise, I will.
Senator from Arlington, Senator Favola.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I move passage of the bill.
Actually,
can I get to that?
To start with the committee substitute, moving the substitute. It's been moved. Do you need to speak to that, or do you want to speak to passage?
I can speak to passage.
Okay. Question is, shall the committee substitute be adopted? We haven't adopted it yet. Shall the committee substitute be adopted? All in favor of the motion will say aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it. The committee substitute is adopted. Senator from Arlington, Senator Favola.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the bill pass, and speaking to that motion.
Senator has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. What we have just done is we have conformed House Bill 714 to my Senate Bill 94, and it's important to note that Senate Bill 94 merely articulates energy policies and then talks about an energy plan. Both of these sections are already in code. What my bill does and what you all passed out of the Senate is it establishes a carbon reduction net emission goal for all sectors by 2045 and a carbon emission reduction, net carbon emission reduction goal for the electric power sector by 2040. And then we expand the number of stakeholders under the Virginia Energy Plan section to include solar, wind, energy, and other sectors, including the industrial sector. And we will be at some point adding the natural gas sector. So for those reasons, for the fact that this is an important context for the many bills we've been hearing this year on reducing carbon emissions, I respectfully ask that the body pass the bill. Thank you.
Thank the Senator. For what purpose does the Senator from King George, Senator Stewart, rise?
The gentlelady yield for a question, Mr. President.
Senator yield.
Yes, I yield.
Senator yields. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd ask the gentlelady, I just want to make sure I understand what this bill does. I had the right sections. Does that mean on line 9 there would be no gas or diesel power operated vehicles by 2045?
Senator has the floor.
On line 9 where it says, okay, I pulled up House Bill 714.
Mr. President, I thought I was.
That's not, my line 9 is just a title.
House Bill Amendment in the nature of a substitute. Do I have the wrong one?
That's it. House Bill 714, Amendment in the nature of a substitute. Or do you want to go to my Senate Bill 94?
Line 41, is that the right line? Paragraph 9?
Yeah.
I understand there's a net zero carbon emissions by 2045. Is that in the bill that you...
That is correct. Okay. That's line 41.
Under a net zero carbon emission by 2045, does that mean there would be no gasoline or diesel powered engines in the state allowable?
Senator has the floor.
I would say to the senator that, again, we're getting to that net zero. So the way it was explained to me by our energy experts is there may be still some transitional gasoline operated vehicles as long as we're still at that net carbon reduction or net carbon zero. There's also language in here about transitioning. Remember, this is a plan, so these are policies and a plan. This is not a directive. What this bill does is it amends sections of the code where the governor is expected every 4 years to come up with a 10-year plan that talks about energy goals that the state needs to meet. And it's in that plan, which is not the bill, in the plan that the governor comes up with where certain strategies are articulated.
Further question?
Mr. President, speaking to the bill.
Senator, it's the floor.
I appreciate the gentlelady's answers to my questions, and I appreciate the fact that this is a policy, but it seems to me that we should not be adopting a policy that says you cannot use gasoline or diesel by the year 2045. I don't think we're in any way, shape, or form ready to commit to any such of a policy as that, particularly in our agricultural community. And then you can't have any carbon emissions for electricity by 2040 under this bill. And again, I'm a supporter of solar power and wind power and all of this alternative energy, and I vote for it. Oftentimes at the chagrin of some of my colleagues on this side of the aisle. But this is not achievable. It is simply not achievable to say that we're going to be carbon free in the electricity sector by 2040 and no gasoline or diesel engines by 2045. So if we're going to adopt a policy, it should at least be a policy that we could achieve.
Thank you, Senator. For what purpose is the senior senator from Virginia Beach, Senator D. Steph, rise?
Mr. President, will the young lady from, I believe it's Arlington, yield for a question?
Will Senator yield?
Yes, I will yield.
Senator yield, you have the floor.
Mr. President, if you could ask the young lady on line basically 28 of the bill, line 41, 42, 43, and 44, that we really are talking about any motor vehicle, any vehicle that burns petrochemicals. Mr. President, if you can ask the gentlelady what technologies will power our airplanes by 2040 or 2045 to meet those goals.
Senator, the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would say to the senator, the senior senator from Virginia Beach, we are not dictating anything. We are merely saying on lines 41 through 45 that we are going to establish greenhouse gas emissions reduction standards. We don't say what they are. That is to be determined by a group of stakeholders who will be working on this plan. The intent of this bill is to merely establish a framework. As you know, science and technology is changing very rapidly. So we deliberately did not put any, identify any technologies that should be listed now because we thought they'd be outdated rather quickly. So this is a framework for a plan, and this is a goal. It is a goal. It's not, you're not going to be, the state's not going to be penalized if it doesn't meet the goal. It is a goal.
Mr. President, follow-up question.
Senator yield. Senator Favola, Senator yield for another question.
Yes, Mr. President, I yield.
Senator yield, you have the floor.
Mr. President, can you have the gentlelady tell me in line 24, 25, 41 through 45, which we're talking about now, where the word goal shows up anywhere in those lines?
Senator, the floor.
Mr. President, I would say to the senior senator from Virginia Beach that under the section 67-102, the title of the section is Commonwealth Energy Policy. So when you're talking about policy, you are talking about the articulation of goals. And in the next section of this bill, we talk about an energy plan. So first we lay out the policies in broad terms, and we don't direct the governor or those who are contributing to the plan on how to get there. In the next section of the bill, it's the development of the Virginia Energy Plan.
Further question?
Mr. President, one last question.
Senator yield.
I'd like to speak to the bill.
Yes, Mr. President, I yield.
Mr. President, paragraph 5, line 24, where it talks about promoting the generation of electricity through technologies that do not contribute to greenhouse gas and global warming. I'm sorry.
That's current law.
Line 28, paragraph 6, where it says promote the use of motor vehicles that utilize alternative fuels that are highly energy efficient.
That's current law. That was renumbered, but that was already in the statute.
Mr. President, would the gentlelady agree that that's kind of one of the policies we're pushing here?
Senator has the floor.
Philosophically.
Thank you, Mr. President. Well, the current line 28 is in the current statute that's governing our energy policy. Promote the use of motor vehicles that utilize alternative fuels and are highly energy efficient is already something that the state is doing.
Mr. President, speaking to the bill.
Senator, the floor.
I'm glad the gentlelady agrees that that is the policy of what we should be doing and that we should be pushing these energy policies for certain things and not for others. And Mr. President, there's no technology out there that I've seen or I'm aware of short of nuclear engines, which I don't believe we would ever put into our airplanes, at least not in the next 50 years, that I've seen that would propel one of our aircraft or the FAA would allow on one of our aircrafts for energy and renewable energy to propel those motors. And I'm glad we're in agreement that when we talk about vehicles and motor vehicles, that our policy is to promote alternative fuels and that are highly efficient, highly energy efficient. And that as we today have electric vehicles, that when we want to promote a policy for something, and when somebody pays extra to implement those policies to have a zero carbon footprint or minimize the carbon footprint, whether it's an electric vehicle or not, that those policies that we're pushing forward in our plans like this that are going over to the governor, I find it a little maybe even hypocritical that we're going to promote these as our policies on one hand, then on another have a different policy move forward that says we're going to tax it. We're going to tax it when you buy it. We're going to tax it when you use it. We're going to tax it as if it's a gasoline engine. And that to me seems somewhat hypocritical, Mr. President. And I think that these are very laudable goals, but normally when it comes to a technology that we're putting into our aircraft, it really does take more than 20 or 30 years to get those technologies to propel these engines. And there's no technology that I'm aware of. And if anyone in the bodies can show me a technology or talk to me about a technology, there's no technologies that can propel an aircraft that's not petro-driven. And with that, Mr. President, if we don't want airplanes and we think there's a better way, or maybe we're going to just hyper jump from one place to another or use time machines or other technologies that I've read in science fiction but haven't seen yet or touched or even heard of, I'm not sure how we're going to get there unless we're going to eliminate all air travel in the Commonwealth, which I really wouldn't suggest from a policy standpoint. But if that's a policy we want to proceed forward with, I think we really need to take a hard look at the policies that we're pushing forward in some of our laudable goals. And I think we may want to take a step back and have a better thought or think a little further about what we're pushing in our policies. I understand zero carbon emissions is a way to go, but when we have conflicting policies we're sending over to the governor's mansion, I'm really concerned that we're going the right direction. And when there's no technology to propel our aircrafts outside of petro, I don't know how this is going to happen or how we're going to be able to meet these goals, Mr. President. And with that, I don't think we should be sending bills forward that have things that there's no way we're going to be able to achieve. So with that, I hope the body would vote against this, Mr. President. Thank you.
For purposes, the senior senator from Fairfax, Senator Saslaw, rise.
Mr. President, members of the Senate, the senator from Arlington was exactly right. These are goals, okay? They're not mandates. They don't outlaw anything, all right? And first off, with respect to air travel, that's controlled totally by the federal government. You know, we can't outlaw gasoline-powered, diesel-powered, or gasoline-powered airplanes, and everybody in this room knows it. With respect to cars, gasoline more than diesel, 98.5% of what came out of that tailpipe in 1965, which was the last year there wasn't a single air pollution control item on your car. 98.5% of that has been eliminated. It's burned up in the exhaust system. Catalytic converter burns it all up. We did away with emissions inspection I think about 5, 6, or 7 years ago on the first 3 years of a new car. And the reason was they weren't getting any readings. No carbon dioxide, nitrogen, which are the two items they test for. They weren't getting any readings. It's all being burned up in the catalytic converter. The cars are essentially carbon-free now. And you can bet by 2045 or 2040, they'll be 100%. You know, they're probably 99.8% free. They'll be 100% by then. Right now, you can get a car that weighs 3,500 pounds, 325 horsepower in a four-cylinder car. 325 horsepower in a mid-sized car 50 years ago got about 6 miles to the gallon. Of course, gasoline was only 8 cents a gallon. But that's all it got. Now, it gets 35 miles to the gallon, 40 miles to the gallon. And you look at just in what I've seen in the last 20 years in the increase in technology in gasoline and diesel engines, you can bet that by 2040, 2045, there'll be zero emissions coming out of those. We didn't ban the product. We're trying to get rid of the emissions. And we're moving in that direction anyways. This doesn't outlaw anything. It just sets goals. And it's identical to what we passed earlier in the session, and I would move its passage now.
What purpose, Senator from Franklin County, Senator Stanley, rise?
Thank you, Mr. President. Will the gentlelady yield for a question from Arlington?
Senator Yield.
Yes, Mr. President.
Senator Yield, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd ask the gentlelady, it looks like, of course, this is amending what exists, and it, of course, states that to achieve the objectives enumerated in the code, it shall be the policy of the Commonwealth. And one policy that we had in old paragraph 10, Mr. President, and I draw the gentlelady's attention to, is that before this is being amended, one of our policies in Virginia was to promote the sustainable production and use of biofuels produced from silvicultural and agricultural crops grown in the Commonwealth and support the delivery infrastructure needed for statewide distribution to consumers. And my question, Mr. President, would be to the gentlelady. So as now a policy, we are now finding that biofuels, woody biomass, steam, is not favored in the Commonwealth any longer. Is that true with this policy decision-making bill?
Senator, has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. I guess I would say to the gentleman that we are articulating different priorities, but nothing in this plan would say, no, you're never going to have biomass. So again, this is more an articulation of the kind of renewable energy we want to see, and again, the goals we want to end up with. I don't read my bill to say that something is absolutely excluded. We're trying to get to the net zero carbon emissions across all sectors by 2045. How we get there, this bill articulates examples.
Further question?
Yes, will the gentlelady yield for one?
Senator Yield.
Mr.
Yes, Mr.
Senator
President.
Yield, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I asked the gentlelady, is it then through this policy that we are basically saying that biomass, biofuels, woody biomass, switchgrass grown by our farmers in my area that is used for biofuels is now going to be disfavored for other energy technologies?
Senator, has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. That might be a reasonable interpretation, but I would not say that it would necessarily be that the folks who are developing this plan would necessarily remove it in its totality. Again, we're developing a plan based on priorities, and we have articulated some preferences.
Further question?
No, Mr. President, speak to the bill.
Senator, has the floor.
Mr. President, I tried to stay quiet here in the past couple of weeks, and I know you guys have enjoyed it. You're welcome. And but I think when we're talking about a policy that is rewriting what our energy policy is, and certainly when you see, if you go through the highlighted section to see what has been taken out and replaced with, I see that the fossil fuels are being replaced by carbon-free emissions, that creating a carbon-free footprint. That's the goal of Virginia, but it says to achieve that. And the gentlelady, who I respect very much, says that there are people out there that are going to take this more like a menu and then make more like a recipe and then make a soup out of it. But quite frankly, any stakeholder or any person that's going to look at this is going to try to stick to this right down to the numbers. And I am disturbed, Mr. President, I am bothered by the implications in two ways. One, we have touted and encouraged our farmers in the Commonwealth of Virginia to grow switchgrass. In our forestry industry, which is one of the number one industries in my district, employs next to our hospitals and healthcare systems the most people in the Commonwealth, produces billions of dollars in revenue, tax money that helps our region and area, is that we have a lot of those farmers using woody biomass, pellets, excess from forestry harvestation. And when they cut down a tree, they put one right back up, they plant another one. And so there has been a large investment in my area in that kind of biofuels, biomass that is used in what have been converted coal-fired plants to biomass. I have a client of mine who I respect very much who created a boiler system, Mr. President, that uses woody biomass to create steam. And from that steam, heated water to the point where it becomes steam, it then generates energy. That replaces number 2 fuel oil, which is a fossil fuel, to heat a university. Moreover, it creates electricity. That steam going through the turbine creates electricity that can funnel and create electricity for that university. It's been touted as a great advance in clean energy. And yet what we're saying is no longer. It's no longer a priority. Woody biomass, biofuels, not a priority, not even in the transition. And the one that it affects is not just the entrepreneur who seeks to do these things based on promises we made to them that it would be okay, it will be fine. It's an alternative clean energy source. But more important to the farmer, our farmer, your farmer, because here's why. They make your food. I think earlier in the session it was stated that it just doesn't show up in Wegmans, that there is a source that makes that food, and that is our farmer. So if we're going to have equipment to harvest that cannot use diesel fuels or regular gas, how are we going to get it out of the ground? How are we going to get it to your Wegmans and your Publix? How? I'll tell you how. We're not gonna. I would suggest, Mr. President, that this bill is not only short-sighted, it is funneled in one direction that does not include any other source of alternative energy that might not use fossil fuels. It's going the wrong direction. And you're hurting the farmer. You're hurting the farmer being able to grow the products needed for us to survive and to be sustained. And you're hurting the farmer who has decided to turn some of his or her fields into switchgrass or biomass. You're hurting the forestry industry who sells that biomass for fuel. So once again, you may say this is just a goal list. It's not, and it's going to have far-reaching implications on not just our infrastructure, but our economy when it comes to the agricultural economy that we depend on in Southside and Southwest Virginia.
For what purpose is the junior senator from Virginia Beach? Senator Kiggins, rise.
I rise just with a question for the senator from Arlington, if she'll yield.
Senator yield.
I'm happy to yield. Yes.
Senator yields. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. Hard to follow the senator from Franklin County, but I just had a quick question. If there's any type of exemption for the military or bases, of which we have many in my district. I know it's a federal entity, so will they be under the same requirements or some of the same restrictions for their aircraft, vehicles, that type of thing?
Senator's the floor.
I would answer the gentle lady that this is a state plan. We are not going to expand beyond our state authority. So federal bases and things that would be regulated under federal law would not be within this purview. So I hope that answers your question. And since I have the microphone, I do want to say, in response to the senator from Franklin County, if you read line 64 through line 69, there is an advisory board of stakeholders when when the governor sits down to develop the Virginia Energy Plan. And we have added, at the request of industry and the farmers, we've added not only environmental groups, but manufacturing groups, agricultural organizations, and utility groups. So this is an effort to bring all of Virginia along. There will be a painstaking process of ensuring we can transition appropriately without losing our bread basket. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you.
Thanks, Senator. For what purpose, Senator from Western Fairfax? Senator Marsden.
Thank you, Mr. President. Speak briefly to the bill.
Senator's the floor.
I think there's a little bit of a conflict here between carbon-free, which certainly, what the gentleman from Franklin was talking about, and net zero. Net zero doesn't mean that all carbon-producing things go away. It's just that you can net it out by mitigating it. For instance, there is a plant in South Boston, Virginia, that takes wood off the forest floor, sawdust, things like that are going to create methane, a far worse form of carbon than what they would get from burning it. And so what it's doing is mitigating that. I met recently with some folks from Salesforce, and this is a fantastical number, and I'm going to throw it out there. They basically told me, look, the Earth used to have 3 trillion trees. We're down to 1. If you put 1 back, you mitigate 66% of the carbon that we've created since the industrial age takes over. Now, 1 trillion trees, how do you do that? I don't know. But it is possible. They're dedicated as a company to do 100 million. There may be things popping up, but remember, to get it net zero, you can mitigate things that are actually creating carbon as long as you come out net. I think that is what it's getting at, but the bill also talks about carbon-free, so that does create, I think, some confusion here, and I think it's one of these things where you can both points of view here are essentially correct.
Mr. President.
Senator from Franklin County, Senator Stanley.
Will the gentleman from some part of Fairfax yield for a question?
Senator from Western Fairfax yield.
The western part, yes, sir.
Senator yields. You have the floor.
Mr. President, I would ask the gentleman, my friend, I see these are a little more than aspirational goals, but what part of, how much percentage is Virginia's carbon footprint compared to the rest of the United States and the rest of the world, and especially China and India?
Senator's the floor.
I would say a fraction thereof, but all we can do is what we can do with what we create and what we eliminate and what we mitigate. And that is the goal of this bill, is to net out as to where we're either not creating or taking carbon out of the air in greater amount than we're creating it. If that makes any sense. And but that's what we're trying to do here, is to get to net. We can't get to carbon free. I agree. That will continue to happen. But if you can get to net by mitigating that carbon which you're creating, that is essentially what the goal of the bill is.
Mr. President, will the gentleman yield from Western Fairfax for one more question?
Senator yield. Senator Marsden.
I yield.
Senator yield. You have the floor.
So let's say we get to net carbon zero. How much carbon reduction worldwide in comparison to China, who's not bound by this policy, and India, who's not bound, that country not being bound by this policy? How much of a reduction by adopting everything in this policy that you want to adopt? How much reduction in the carbon footprint in the world will we have accomplished? And again, I want a number.
Senator's the
percentage. The number is 6, and I would ask that the gentleman from Franklin send a letter to the world to tell them to get on board, because in Virginia we're trying to do the right thing. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President, he needs a nap.
Thank you, Senator. For what purpose is the senior senator from Chesapeake, Senator Cosgrove, rise?
Thank you, Mr. President. Will the senator from Arlington take the floor for a question?
Senator Yield?
Yes, Mr. President.
Senator Yield, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Hold on, stop. Guys.
Mr. President, I asked the gentlelady, I'm looking at the bill, And normally when we have bills like this, it says, this term means this and this term means that. No place in this bill do I see where net zero is defined. Really, net zero. Is there a definable, tangible term?
Mr. President.
There's the floor.
Okay, Mr. President, I would answer again, the stakeholders, when we asked that question, means we were told that when you look at all of the carbon emissions from all of the sectors, net zero would be the accumulation of all of them together. So let me explain it a different way. One sector may in fact not get to zero, but another sector may get to zero. If you have enough sectors reaching zero or better, if there is a better, and you've got some who can't quite get there, if you calculate them all together, you could end up with a net zero, which is sort of the way it was explained. In other words, not every sector is going to get to zero. We just have to get to a net zero. Really, the representative from Dominion could do a much better job explaining what I tried to explain, but I hope I gave you some broad, general explanation that you can understand.
Mr. President, just speaking briefly.
There's the floor.
I thank the gentlelady for trying to establish what net zero is, but just using simple arithmetic or even mathematics, in order to get to net zero, you would have to have something that goes below zero. So there are positives and there are negatives. And so if you have lots of negatives, your positives can be offset by those negatives. But I don't know how we get to a negative position for a net zero sum. In addition, it seems like the starting point, or x equals zero, changes from day to day to day. So I'm just really confused about the whole net zero complex. It's an engineering thing. Basically, the math just doesn't work. So anyway, I thank the gentlelady for putting up with me. Thank you.
Good. Senator from Arlington, Senator Favola.
I will just respond. I think it is an industry term, and the representatives from the utilities agreed that the net zero term was in fact the proper term to use, and there has been agreement on this bill from all of the sectors, which is saying something. The utilities, Dominion, the environmentalists, the agricultural community is happy. They were added to the stakeholder group. So everybody feels comfortable that the process in place will move forward in a rational way that will include all of those stakeholders who need to be included, and it will in fact end up in a positive for the state. Having said that, Mr. President, I do hope this is again the will of the body to pass this measure. We passed it once before, so I'd like to pass it again. Thank you very much.
And Senator, for what purpose? Senator from Roanoke City, Senator Edwards.
Mr. President, I'm not a scientist, but I believe trees and vegetation absorb carbon into the system. And then when you burn it, it releases carbon into the atmosphere. And I think that's what we're talking about, net zero. So the idea is not to add more than is absorbed into the soil and into the trees and vegetation so that we get to net zero. I believe that's the answer. Again, I'm not a scientist, but I believe that's right.
Thanks, Senator. For what purpose? Senator from Northwestern Fairfax, Senator Boysko, rise.
Thank you, Mr. President. Speaking to the bill.
Senator's the floor.
So we've been talking about this a long time, and we know that the gentle lady from Arlington had an almost identical bill, which passed 21-18. I don't think we're going to be changing anybody's mind in here, and I know that we have a long roster of things to do, but I would just remind the body that this codifies Executive Order 43 set by the governor for his energy plan, and sets up the advisory board, which is a broad scope of people. I will just again remind us all that we've already voted on a very similar piece of legislation in this body, and I don't see that any minds and hearts have been changed on this, and I urge us to vote for it.
For what purpose is the senior senator from Virginia Beach, Senator D. Steph, rise?
Mr. President, I hate to impose on the body's time a second time on this issue. However, this body should be basing our decisions on facts and figures. And, Mr. President, I always say cite your source, and a few folks, like the junior senator from Richmond and I, have had a few conversations about that, all in jest, but we do say cite your source. And, Mr. President, I wanted to point out a couple of things. So we talk a little bit about trying to get carbon-free and reducing the carbon footprints in Virginia. Well, as we a couple of days ago talked about the VCHEC facility, which is fueled 20% by biomass, which is considered carbon neutral by the EPA, we're talking about closing that facility. Well, Mr. President, when we close that facility, where are we going to get the power? Or even better yet, where does the power for most of Northern Virginia come from? It comes from West Virginia, from a little plant out there called Mount Storm, which is a coal-fired plant that was built with 60s technology. Some of the dirtiest, most horrendous carbon producing plants in the country. And we're talking about closing a plant that is almost carbon neutral, is one of the cleanest plants in all of the Americas. So I want to make sure that when we talk conflicting priorities and when I talk about the policies we're doing here, and let's straighten out a couple of other facts. The typical passenger car today emits 4.6 metric tons of carbon dioxide. That's far from carbon free. Now, just if anyone's got a calculator and they want to look at the engineering side of that, that's based on 22 miles per gallon. That's based on 11,500 miles per year, and it's based on a car that was built in 2019. And, Mr. President, I just want to say every gallon of gasoline burned by today's vehicle produces 8,887 grams of carbon. Thank you very much.
Question is, shall House Bill 714 pass? All in favor of the motion will record their vote aye. Those opposed, no. Are the senators ready to vote? Have all the senators voted? Do any senators desire to change their vote? The clerk will close the roll.
Ayes 21, noes 19.
Ayes